The whole idea of religion in the ancient world related to the idea of nature, the rhythm of nature. Now, I can tell you in the ancient world, what we would call the Mesopotamian world, you had developed basically a pure nature religion, very similar to what we think of as New Ageism today. Hardly anything new under the sun, change the names, but same view. And then you developed another view called materialism. You may be familiar with the debates between what was called Stoicism and Epicureanism in the ancient Greco-Roman world. The Stoics today, whereas Epicureans were materialists. All that existed is matter. And the same debate is with us today too. But you find a rejection of this pagan view among the prophets of Israel and the early church. When you look at a creation view, like you found in Mesopotamia, called a Enuma Elish, you find that the gods were viewed as part of the natural processes. There was not a God separate from nature. For example, there are some similarities, but you'll soon see some dissimilarities. In Enuma Elish, the watery chaos separated into a heaven and an earth, as in Genesis 1:2. There were light, pre-existing creation of sun, moon, and stars. The number 7 is predominantly used. All these particular views of creation found in the ancient world, some are found in Enuma Elish, but you find something quite different in the biblical account in Genesis. Also true here with what is known as the Atrahasis epic, the Babylonian epic. You have God ruling the heavens and the earth in the Babylonian view, man made from clay and blood, man tending land for the lesser gods. By the way, in the ancient Mesopotamian perspective, and specific here the Babylonian one, what you find is that the reason for human beings is to serve the gods for the purpose of feeding them. Gods are sitting around eating grapes all day, fed by humans, which is not the idea of the biblical God. Men multiply because of trouble and so forth. The flood sent to destroy mankind, and sort of the issue of what we think of as the Noah account. Here's an interesting view in the Tibet. You've heard of that? Tibetan Book of the Dead, written down in the 8th century A.D. Here's a great view. Osiris, who by the way was also very popular in the Mediterranean world, whose word is truth, says, I fly up out of primeval matter. I came into being like the god Hepera. I germinated like the plants. That sounds like a good creation view. Here the Greeks, an examiner, taught that men had evolved from fish. It's up-to-date thinking. Empedocles believed that animals had been derived from plants. Now these are some early biological perspectives that are recent. Modern evolution is more sophisticated, but really fundamentally the same nature religion. Worship nature instead of the Creator. Romans chapter 1. What is biblical cosmology in contrast? Here we have it. You have the scientific community arguing one level, you have the comparative religions view arguing another, and you have literary criticism arguing another. So let's look at those. The attack from the scientific community is macroevolution. I showed you this earlier, right? The approach is the belief in the evolution of human beings, of man. The answer to this, well, a faith position that cannot be supported by empirical data. Supposedly, okay? Now, comparative religions, you have pagan myths. The view of world religionists and also anthropologists for many, many years, at least since the time of Darwin, is that you have and I should say even before the time of Darwin, because you had some developing this in the late 18th century too, but really found its really hold in since Darwinism, is that the viewpoints in the Bible are evolutionary in nature. People started out with animism and belief that all the rocks and the streams and the trees were all individual little deities. And then they got more sophisticated and came to polytheism, believing in multiple gods who, not individual trees, but nonetheless the sun and the moon and the stars, these were gods, and certain other things were gods, thunderbolts thrown by Zeus and so forth, or Odin or whoever. And eventually moved to henotheism, that is, my God is better than your God, even though there are other gods, mine's the best God. To monotheism, that in fact there is only one God. So that people would say monotheism is the highest form of the evolution of religion. Scholars are finding now, in large part, that the world, and this doesn't surprise me, that the original view of religion was monotheistic that devolved into what we think of as polytheism and animism and such. Well, that's true. The original view was one God that gradually became many gods. Last view is literary criticism. Anybody familiar with the Jesus Seminar? That's a view of literary criticism of the Scripture. Other views like the JEDP theory, what is called the documentary hypothesis, that is that the books of Moses originated over a period of hundreds of years by different authors, contradictory to each other, piecemeal, scissor and paste approach. All these views believe in the evolution of religion, not only biblical stories. Now, under biblical cosmology, you have what is called the Sitzungsleben. That's German, for those of you who speak German. Means situation in life. Refers to the context in which things are taught. In Joshua chapter 1 through 9, if you read that passage, you find out that having failed to go into the land of Canaan, that generation died out in the wilderness, right? The new generation, including Joshua and Caleb, goes into the land. What they were concerned about, wall cities and big giants, God wiped out both of them. It was never a problem. It was only in their mind. It wasn't in God's problem. Second generation gets ready to enter a pagan land of Canaanites who believed in many, many gods and all sorts of strange views. The second generation then would face a pagan worldview that was captured in Sumerian creation stories, Akkadian creation stories. Then you have Indian, and you have countless others that gradually the pagan world had, many of which had come into Canaan. So when they're going to encounter these pagans, how are they going to deal with these pagans? Well, obviously they're going to go in and be taught by them. They're going to enroll their kids in the pagan schools and say, listen, will you teach our kids your pagan views? Isn't that right? No. What you had was a conflict in which they found it necessary to resist these kind of perspectives. Nature deities, sun, moon, and stars, worship cosmic deities locked in mortal combat, like the Titans and the gods of Olympus and their big fights. And you have the same true in the Mesopotamian area, not only in Greece. Deities constantly going birth and death, metamorphosis and chaos and on and on. The pagan world's views. What is going on in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses? Moses writes these books, getting ready for the people to go into Canaan. What kind of information is he going to provide them to help them to succeed in Canaan against this paganism? Well, he tells them that they're to be holy. So we have a call to separation based on the future temptation from that pagan view. The word holy essentially means to be separate, to distinct. I don't think there was anything inherently wrong from wearing mixed cloth. Nothing morally wrong. There's nothing wrong with eating probably certain kinds of the foods and different things. But God wanted to impress upon these Israelites that they were in fact a different kind of people, so He gave them visible symbols to help them understand that. Separation from the pagan view. God revealed a worldview in Genesis 1 that would function as a polemic against the paganism, an answer. His view is radically different from the popular belief in Canaan at the times the Jews entered the land then. Now, something to recognize, the biblical writers used the imagery and terminology of their contemporary world, but did not accept the worldview, the paradigm, the integrative principle, as it were. I've given two words in German here. One is Weltbild, the other is Weltanschauung. And these two words convey an idea for us. A Weltbild is the idea of how people express in the current terminology the ideas that they have. For example, you can have a person who's an who's a creationist who may use the word protozoa. The protozoa is a term which means first life. Comes out of an evolutionary view. And yet a creationist might use that term, since that is the term in vogue, but hold a different worldview in discussing the term. You see what I'm saying? You with me? It's important to grab this thought. Terminology, yes. The paradigm or integrated principle of understanding it, no. Now, there is a polemical function then in Genesis chapter 1. There are similarities. Israel's neighbors borrowed. They borrowed some things. There's coincidence between what Israel uses and they don't. Israel borrowed from pagans. Well, maybe some terminology and such. You may have a common source. How do you deal with the question of similarities between the two? Notice that in the Genesis account here, over against the pagan account here. In pagan views, you had nature deities. You may be familiar with that. The god Baal, sometimes pronounced Baal. Hebrew it's Baal. In Canaanite it's Baalu. That's the term, Baal. The god who the Israelites fight, so to speak. That's the god of Elijah. Eliah. You know that? Eliah. That's his name. Eliah. Means my God is Yahweh. By the way, some of you in just a short time from now, not a short distance, but a short time from now, will be standing up there on Mount Carmel where Elijah stood against the prophets of Baal. And he encountered this. He says, if Baal be God, follow him. If Yahweh be God, follow him. And we have this wonderful story which I will tell you in some interesting detail on Carmel, things you have not probably ever heard before about that text. And I'll be sharing some of that with you. But the idea here is that you have this pagan deity that the people tried to enlist on their behalf through ceremonial form. Now, some of these ceremonial forms were things that would lend themselves to the natural inclinations of the flesh. Sexual prostitution. They would go into the temple and have sexual acts with the prostitutes. Why? So that Baal would look on them in this midst of this worship, and he then would be elicited to have lust in his heart for what's going on, and then he would have sex with Asherah, the female deity, and thus fertility would come to the land, and rain and crops. There you have it. Don't have to pray much, just have sex and it comes. And the temples were full. Temples were full. That's what you call seeker-sensitive worship. Just meet their needs, whatever they are. Now, so you have these nature deities. And yet, for the Israelites, there was only one God, not many, who created nature, who was not a part of the natural process. So they believe that Baal and these other deities were caught up in nature themselves. They were part of the whole process. They came out of they weren't beyond creation and created the world. Creation was always there, and they came out of creation. That's what's called the theogony, the birth of the gods. They came out of nature. Nature always existed. God is above nature. He brings into existence out of nothing nature. He's transcendent. Totally different view. The chaos, that should be CH, threatened to break the structures of life. There was a lot of struggles in the ancient world among the pagans. Lots of fear, problems, and concerns, whether you please a deity or not, based on a number of factors. There was a view that the world was in a state of tremendous struggle. And yet Israelites said, no, there's no struggle. God's in charge. God's in control. There's no problems. It may look like it to you, but God knows what's going on, and He's bringing it out for His own purposes. The pagan gods undergo this birth and death metamorphosis, whereas there's no theomachy, which is the idea of the making of the gods. The sun, moon, and the stars are deified gods. Look how God presents the sun, moon, and the stars in this Genesis. They're not gods. They're merely lamps to light the earth. You don't present any light and dark struggles going on, light fighting darkness, like you have in the pagan myths. Light and darkness and fighting with each other. Who's going to win? The struggling, the breakup of the world, and all these things. God's just it's like potter with a clay. No struggle. Cosmic deities and mortal combat, no one can challenge God the Creator. So there is literary continuity in the Genesis account, unlike what you find with the pagan myths. You do have some aspects in common. I think I'm going to wait on this because I need to show this to you when I get to a certain slide. I'll show that to you, what this happens. But you have certain things in common. You have this clause that seems to relate to the question of creation. You have a primeval, dark, watery, formless void in Genesis 1:2. You do have it in paganism, although understood differently than the biblical account. And the order of creation seems to be the idea of darkness and deep and devoid of form. Some similar ideas, but we'll explain how that's so in a little bit. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go into these, but the Old Testament and the New Testament have much to say about creation. You can do a good study on that question, just reading all these passages I'm giving you. Various things, the days of creation sometimes talked about. When you get to the New Testament, you have a lot of statements of creation also. Quite a few verses. And then you have something interesting. The Bible believes that Adam and Eve are historical figures. I suspect if you were to run into a lot of Christians today and talk to them, and you really talk to them about whether Adam and Eve were historical figures, like, Moses or like George Washington, they would say, no, they're symbols. That is, there really never was a garden in which two people lived, and they actually had a snake, and they actually sinned at that point. Now, this is a story to tell us about man and his degradation and difficulties and sin. And trying to find what is called an etiology, some way to explain where we are. Now, the biblical writers see it as a true historical fact. And the fact that Jesus saw it as historical settles the question for me. Because if Jesus doesn't know, we are in trouble. Now let's talk about the theories. There's one view called the pre-chaotic theory. I'm going to have you to look in Genesis chapter 1 with me. The statement in the Hebrew here is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Of course, you already knew that. But you start off with in the beginning. That's an absolute construction in my view. The pre-chaotic theory tends to follow the idea of the Mesopotamian perspectives. By this is meant, when you read various Mesopotamian views of creation, they believe that the creation that we see in Genesis 1:1 is in fact not the beginning of the universe, but is actually a statement of what we might call a forming of the world. There is no creation out of nothing, discussed in Genesis 1. Now, some would say, well, there may have been a creation out of nothing, but the Bible doesn't talk about it. This is sometimes called the creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Genesis 1:1 reads in my text, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That is taking the beginning as an absolute beginning. God being the creator and predating creation, beyond creation. And there was a time when creation was not. And then it became, never having existed before. God is first cause, existence by anything, uncaused cause, uncreated being, uncreated creator. So He's beyond the creation here, the heavens and the earth. Now, the pre-chaotic theory, though, would translate it a little differently. They would translate it here, when God began to create the heavens and the earth already was without form and void, and darkness already was upon the face of the deep. And then God said, let there be light. And there, at that point, God is forming what had, to this point, just this material which He has not described in the Bible where it came from. No creation out of nothing. Those who hold this view, even among evangelicals, I believe, do so wrongly, because they believe that the biblical account must be dependent upon pagan mythology for its origins. I would contend that the Bible at times conforms to pagan terminology and ideas, because that's the world in which it comes, and that's the terminology people knew. But it rises above that mythology and corrects it when necessary. In Genesis chapter 1 through 31, we find that Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement with Genesis 1:3 through 3 the account described. By the way, I don't think that's probably wrong as such. In other words, this big statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I think that's sort of how things got going. And then He describes how at that initial stage of creation of the heavens and the earth, the condition of the heavens and the earth at that point, when He did it. In other words, He didn't create like this. God said, poof, let there be, and everything was done instantaneously. It went through a process. I think that's true. He created light before He created light bearers. He created an earth before He created creatures on the earth. He created a sea before He created creatures in the sea. In other words, it wasn't instantaneous. Everything is as it is. I think that's true. I do not agree with some of the other ideas. Genesis 1:1, beginning either is dependent or an independent construction, so there's an argument on that. But I would take it as independent, for sure. So Genesis 1:2 is how the earth was when God began to create. I would say that is the state of the earth at His creation itself. In other words, when He said, let there be, that was how it was, and then He began to structure it and organize it. I do believe Genesis 1-3 following is how He actually brings into, He takes a piece. I think God originally created matter, and then He begins to work with that matter. I think that's true, but I think Genesis 1:1 is talking, and 1:2 is talking about the creation of that matter. Next is a gap theory. Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, here's how it's translated. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But the earth became without form and void, and darkness was in the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. The gap theory says that the original creation was Genesis 1:1. After that original creation, something happened that brought the world into chaos and disorder, possibly a pre-Adamic race of men and women, possibly there the fall of Satan. Something happened that everything went into topsy-turvy. So that 1:3 following is a re-creation. Not out of nothing, but a making new what had been disturbed. So Genesis 1:1 is creatio ex nihilo. Genesis 1:2 is a cataclysmic judgment. And then what you have are these ages that come that we see. Where do you find the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic, all these stages of fossils and all this kind of stuff? Well, it's the fall at Genesis 1:2. Whereas my explanation for all these things you find in the surfaces of the earth relate to the flood, which I think is universal. Uh-oh, it's out of place. There we go. You had some good people that held this view. There were a lot of people who used to hold the gap theory. C.I. Scofield, I believe, also did in his Scofield Reference Bible. Other people, they think these things occurred during this time. Based on a misunderstanding, in my opinion, of a couple of things. One is they believe that the word bara in Hebrew is a word, they say bara refers to creatio ex nihilo. That is, bara is when you're dealing with not reforming or remaking, but original creation. Whereas the Hebrew word asa refers to recreation. The problem with the view is that one can study bara and asa together in several contexts and they're used as synonyms. So, 2, is there really a gap in 1:2 in which the fall of Satan occurs, the pre-Adamic race occurs, and that you should understand this word as the earth became. If you look in the text, the earth was without form and void is how it reads in my text. Gap theorists believe it should be translated this way. The world became, or the earth became formless and void. The problem with the view, and this is an area I've taken a little time to work on. I did a doctoral course in which this was my paper on the gap theory. And I checked out all this stuff. The point of it is hayata here simply is never translated became. You can't find an example of it. It just doesn't mean it. It's a to-be stative verb. It is not a causative verb of any sort. It does not mean the earth became. That's just reading into the text, not there. There's also the issue of the tohu vavohu that you find here in the next statement. Waste and void, what does that mean? They want to argue, the gap theorists, that this refers to a devastation by God in reference to the judgment of Satan at this point. And there really is no basis of seeing these words that way. What they really mean, tohu refers to that which does not have a form to it yet, and vohu refers to that which does not have habitation. So, tohu vavohu is unformed and uninhabited. Does not refer to anything about destruction. There's no indication in the text. Moreover, you have what is known here as a vav consecutive here. You know, is it a circumstantial or is it, I don't want to get into the Hebrew grammar with you. The point of it is, what? You wanted me to get into Hebrew grammar and lose everybody? Okay. So the issue is, do you take this vav, for example, are you talking about something that is referring to a contrast, referring to something that is a simple continuative? And that's what we're dealing with. And it's a continuative in the text. There's no contrast between 1:2 and 1:1. That makes Genesis 1:3 through 2:4 as a recreation. One problem with that view that's very, very hard to work with is the fact that here you have God at the very end of the days of creation looking at the universe with possibly millions, if not billions of years of difficulties inside the earth. Pre-Adamic race been destroyed. Satan's been leased. The world is turning bad. And he recreates and says, man, everything is really great. How can you say that? It'd be hard. Next is the day-age theory, built on the concept of yom. Now, if you know Hebrew, I just want you to know that that final name here is not here because I couldn't get my computer to give me one. But that's not a final name in Hebrew. But yom, the word day in Genesis refers to an age or indefinite period of time. You heard this view? That each of the days of Genesis 1 are in fact, day ages. I don't think that's true. But that is an argument, and many people have held it of good, really good people. But the problem is, every time you see the word yom in the Hebrew Bible with what is known as an ordinal, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth, always a solar day. I don't know why to go to Genesis 1 and make it different. Some people argue, well, the day-age theory agrees with modern science. And so that indicates that when you look at modern science and look at the days of the creation, man, everything agrees. And so forth. Well, let's see. And there's some ways in which they try to argue the same. But I have a chart which you can see to give this to you. If you look at the biblical order of appearance and the evolutionary order of appearance, what modern scientists argue with the Bible argues are not really exactly the same. For example, the Bible says matter is created by God in the beginning, whereas matter existed in the beginning, according to modern science, is not created. You have two views in modern science, primarily the Big Bang theory, and you also have the steady state theory. Steady state theory essentially says that the universe has existed forever. And that's sort of held by some people who believe that you have an expanding universe, a shrinking universe, a expanding universe, a shrinking universe. In other words, there is no true Big Bang in which everything started. That's just simply one example of, in another 10 billion years, it'll all be back to where it was and it'll expand out again. It's like a rubber band. Of course, you have to deal with how you create energy like that and how you don't lose energy so that every year your Big Bang will be smaller and smaller and smaller. You know what I'm saying? You're dissipating energy. You can't sustain that forever. That's why when you take and bounce a basketball, just let it bounce for a while, just stop. Because it loses energy. And it cannot exert itself as much the next time. So if you have an expanding universe, it may go way out, but when it comes back in a few billion years, and comes in again and goes back out again, it's not going to have the same energy level. And if this was an eternal process, it would already cease to exist. You understand that? You cannot have an infinite regression in time from an eternal, it's just not possible. If something existed eternally, and yet it's digressing, which it does, second law of thermodynamics, you have a digression, then it would have already been out of existence. We wouldn't be here to talk about it. So anyway, biblical order of appearance, earth before the sun and the stars in the Bible, whereas the sun and the stars before the earth in modern science. Oceans are before the land in the Bible, land before the oceans in science. Light before the sun in the Bible, earth's light's first light, see? Atmosphere between the two waters, atmosphere above a water layer, on and on. You look through these examples of the two, and look particularly at number 12. Man is the cause of death in the Bible, whereas death was a necessary antecedent of men because there have been things dying for millions of years before human beings. So, I don't think you can correspond those two well. Age theory, and also builds a little bit on the alternate view of the solar day theory called progressive creationism. Are you familiar with this view? Progressive creationism primarily says that one of two things. One is that these days that we see, which are long periods of time, are long periods, are there pictorial days. That is, they're not really days that happen. They're days in which we describe what happened. They are pictures of the creation. It's more imagery than real. Another possibility is that the 24-hour periods are not consecutive. And maybe a better word to use there is not I guess consecutive is okay. It wouldn't be good to say successive because clearly they're successive. But they're not contiguous. Let's see, explain how that works. And by the way, some very fine people believe this view, and I don't think it's heretical by any means. The view is this. One view is like the day-age view, in which you have various groups to come together in the pictorial. But let me say the third view, which is held by some. So you have day one. It actually occurs in a solar period of 24 hours. The actual creation occurs on that 24-hour period. And then that day continues to the present. That is, the results of that day go on for all the rest of the earth, including today. Then somewhere along the process, maybe here somewhere, let's say 10 million years in, day two occurs. And on day two, everything is created that we see in the Bible. And then it continues to the present. All those things that happen on day two. And then another period, I'm getting smaller here, but day 3 and day 4 and day 5 and so forth and so on, all the way, let's say, to day 6. These are not contiguous. They're separate. They're solar days, all right. And what the Bible says happened on those days is true. They're not denying the Bible here. But these days are not next to each other. They're separated by millions of years. Each of these 6 24-hour periods are separated by millions of years, at which all these events occur. Now, that's not an unreasonable position. I mean, that's a possibility. I don't think that's what we have in the text, but at least it's not like evolutionary, theistic evolution, or possibly some other views. Okay, you understand that? Another view is called fiat creationism. This would be a view that I think is more reasonable. But that you have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, all are 6 24-hour periods consecutive to each other, and then then God rested on the 7th 24-hour period. And sure, we are all experiencing all the effects of that 6-day creation today. Mountains are still around, people still around, plants around, sun's still hanging around, all these things. And there are different ways to look at it. But, that's where I want to take just a moment with you and look at my outline, where I say here, is recent creation necessary? And I say the when of creation is a secondary issue. First page. This is my little thing. Chapter 7, Anthropology. I think this view is probably the correct view. I think God first created the universe in the sense that He created all the matter stuff. He created all the stuff. The stuff wasn't there when He started creating. He created the stuff. And then He began to form the stuff. And I'm going to show you more on that in just a second. I'll make more sense of it. But notice what I say here. I don't think time is the real issue. The real issue is a difference between naturalism and supernats, which I'll talk to you in a minute about, and fiat creation, God being a being who creates. So I want to make the question of time secondary to the question of source and possibly the question of method. So this view, creato ex nihilo, would say Genesis 1:1 discusses creato ex nihilo, although not in scientific terms, as a general statement developed more fully later. Genesis 1:2 discusses concurrent chaos with cosmos, the first stage of creation. That's when God creates the stuff. Remember, before God created anything, there was only God. And then God, who existed from all eternity by Himself, out of nothing, not out of Himself, not out of some stuff He has, but out of nothing creates all that is not God. He creates a spiritual world out of nothing, and He creates a physical world out of nothing. He creates the stuff that is what we call creation. And then He starts to do something with it. There are some similarities. A summary statement here, the fact that Genesis 1:3 through 2:3, first 3 days in Genesis seem to talk about what is unformed. Second 3 days seem to talk about what is unfilled. I'll show you that to you. I think what is happening, though, is that in the biblical account, we are developing ideas that contrast with that of the ancient world. You present the sun, moon, and the stars, again, not as deities, but as luminaries. You present the Tehom, the deep, and the Yam, the sea, and the Tanim, the creatures. You create all these Hebrew and also Canaanite concepts, which they consider to be deities in chaos and in conflict. The biblical account presents them as pliable things in the hand of the God Yahweh. See? A different view of the world. The meaning of bara, create, I don't think necessarily means creation out of nothing, but it certainly provides. It is not specifically, I don't think, that word, but I think it certainly includes or provides for that. Now, here's what I think we see. Genesis 1:1 is an introduction. Genesis 1:3 through 31 is the way in which what was without form took on form, and what was without fullness took on fullness. Okay? So light and dark is form. Lights of day and night are fullness. See what I'm saying? They're what inhabits. The light is within the form. The light expresses the habitation of the form. Sea and sky is the form. Creatures are the habitation of the form, the fullness. Fertile earth is the form. It was unformed, and then it took on form. God had this stuff. He created what we call earth, and then He filled it. Fullness. And so actually these accounts are trying to express this idea. And there's some other things here to talk about. The divine fiat, let there be. And then it was. Let it be, and it was. Let it be, and it was. Then you have a conclusion in which He states a summary to what had happened. I think this is what you have in Genesis chapter 1. This is, I think, the proper way to structure the text. Rational arguments for an intelligent designer. There's only 3 ways that you can have what we call creation. Postulated. 3 possible, I shouldn't say it that way. 3 ways in which this has been postulated by people. 1 is self-creation. That is, the universe created itself. 2, chance creation. That is, it all happened by time and chance. Given enough time and chance, anything can happen. 3, by a creator. So let's examine those. 1. Self-creation is impossible. Not improbable, not likely. It is absolutely impossible. This violates the law of non-contradiction, in which 2 things cannot be opposites and be the same way at the same time in the same relationship. Can't happen. For to create itself, it would have to be existing to create, which then would nullify the reason why to create. Yes?
Isn't that the atheistic argument against Christianity? Or against God?
See, God didn't create Himself. He always was. Not illogical. This is illogical. It violates the 3rd law of logic, the law of non-contradiction. 2 things cannot both be true in the same way at the same time and be opposites. If creation is here and it creates itself, it can't do it, because if it creates itself, why would it? Because it's already existing, so as not to create itself. It had to be both be and non-be in the same way at the same time. can exist. It's impossible. God is not, because they may state it that way. That's why sometimes people say, well, everything must have a cause, so God must be caused. But I say you've misstated the law. Every effect must have a cause. God is not an effect, He is the cause. He's the uncaused cause, the first cause. There's nothing illogical about having an eternal being. It is illogical to have something that creates itself. That's illogical. But God eternally exists, nothing illogical about it. It may not be in our experience, but there's nothing that, as you structure the argument, that's illogical about it. What about chance creating the universe? Well, chance doesn't create anything because chance doesn't exist. Chance is an abstraction. It's a mathematical abstraction. We use the term all the time, but it doesn't hold any validity. Now, I didn't have a coin with me. I was going to show you something. But if you had a coin in my hand here, you know, say I throw it in the air and it lands, heads, 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 you know. They say, what are the chances of that happening? We use the word chance to express statistically why something ends up the way it is, and that we do not understand why it has happened that way. Chance is not a causal agent. Chance can't do anything. It is not anything. It is a way that we statistically explain why things are statistical. I can't even tell it now. It's too late at night. Let me get some more water here. Yeah, you know what I mean. I said it right the first time. Statistically, happens in the sense of the results of it. But you know why things happen? It's not because chance did anything. It's if I take a coin in my hand and I flip it, the reason why it goes as high as it goes, and the reason why it develops this particular elongation or particular frame of reference has a relationship to where I have it in my hand when I flip it, how much pressure I put to it when I do it, whether there is any resistance in the air to it, and its flipping has all to do with that. And when it comes down, when I put it down, that's why it's heads, not because it did something. Now, if I could somehow, with the same lack of resistance and the same pounds of force and the same exact levitation, or how it's level or whatever, if I could reproduce that every single time, I would get the same thing every single time. The reason why it varies has to do with the change of what they call the variables. And so the point of it is, if I do this without planning it, sometimes the way I do it's going to make the coin flip enough to come down a certain way, and sometimes it's going to do another way. And the reason why it turns out heads or tails has to do not with it doing anything, but with the variables changing as I'm using a causal agent. And cause and effect. Do you understand what I'm saying? We use the term chance to try to explain something that's really not something that it does. They say, well, time and chance, anything can happen. No, it can't. You can have time forever. Give them 100 trillion years of time, and you wouldn't have anything come into existence. Because time is not a causal agent, and I'll show you in a minute. So it can't do anything. Only causal agents can make things happen. Time is a measurement. Chance is not a thing that doesn't. It's not a causal agent. It's a way in which we express what we don't necessarily explain. We don't know the reason. It had to be figured out. It had to be tested. St. Thomas Aquinas developed the cosmological argument. I'm not going to take a lot of time with this. I've already said a lot. But every effect has a cause. The uncaused cause, which is the necessary being, is God. There cannot be an infinite regress of finite causes. Finite means limited. You cannot have with finiteness go on forever, or it would be infinite. So since it's finite, it cannot exist forever. It must somewhere not be. See? The necessary being, unlike this, is God, who is uncaused. Now here's a good statement by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He says, the first question which should rightly be asked is this. This is a great statement. Here's the issue. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the big question. Every effect has a cause, but not everything. The solution of the riddle of life in space, says Wittgenstein, is lying outside of space and time. You do not find the answer to what's going on here within the vehicle itself. You find it outside the vehicle. The second law of thermodynamics says the universe is running down. The reasonable inference from this concept is that it must have had a beginning. For if what is existing now is eternal, it would not exist now. Do you understand why this is so? It could not exist now if it's eternal, because it would have already gone out of existence because it has been decaying. And there would have been a point in the past where it would have stopped already, before now. That's the whole issue of infinite regress. So the absence of an essential being or uncaused cause only leads to self-creation or chance creation, both of which are logically impossible. Somebody's wife wants them. There is an observable order or design in the world that cannot be attributed to the object itself. This being is God. This is the teleological argument. I wonder if I'm trying to think. I think I have that. If I don't come to it in a little while, I want to talk to you about time and space in a moment, but we'll wait on that. The anthropic principle. Anybody familiar with this? There are two forms in which this is expressed. A new book just coming out right now by Jay Richards, who lives here in Seattle at the Discovery Institute. He works there. He's the vice president of it. Jay is a PhD out of Princeton, and he's writing a new book called The Privileged Planet. Now, the way the anthropic principle has been expressed is this. The splendid universe has supreme coherence from the very small to the very large, is consistent unity, free of debilitating paradox, of beautifully proportional layers, and so forth and so on. Sir Isaac Newton, when I look at the solar system, see an Earth at the right distance from the Sun, receive proper amounts of heat and light that does not happen to a chance. You look at the universe and say, listen, everything seems to fit. Now, I can't take a lot of time for this, but let me just say a few things. There are probably at least 100 different things in science if which the proportions were just a little off by a percentage point or two. We wouldn't be here to talk about it. If the variation of oxygen to hydrogen to helium and nitrogen were varied, we wouldn't be able to live. If the gravity pull were varied, it wouldn't work. If the moon was just a little farther away, it wouldn't work. If it were closer, it wouldn't work. If the sun were a little farther away, it wouldn't work. I mean, you start looking at all the construction. But I'm always amused by these scientists who they spend billions of dollars to go to find water on Mars. I could have already told them it's probably there. Why do they go? You know why they want to find water on Mars? Because the assumption is if there's water there, that must mean that it probably gave rise to life there. One of those predictions of evolution, like the dust on the moon. Big deal. I know there's water in the universe because most of your asteroids running around have it. The rings that you find in some of the planets like Saturn and Jupiter, I think, also has rings. No, Uranus does. Are made up of water, crystals. I mean, we know there's water out there besides Earth, so big deal. Doesn't prove a thing. So, but what we find is all the proportions of water and gases and the ozone layer that we have and the distance, all these things seem to indicate that this planet was created to sustain us. That's the anthropic principle. God in the Cosmos, I believe that's the one by Hugh Ross, has some of this, if you want to read it. There's also another book by a couple of evolutionary scientists who believe that this is a issue that has to be dealt with. Honest guys. They have a book called The Rarefied Earth, in which they argued this is a rare phenomenon. There is nothing like it in the universe. Hey, it's got to be that there are millions of planets with people, and why would be special then? Yeah, that's right. That's why Genesis concentrates that God's interested in the earth. You know, it doesn't go into some big science about the sun and the moon and the stars and talking about them. You know what they are? They're lights for the earth. God's interest is the earth. This is where He's decided to do something special. There's also one other aspect of the anthropic principle you should be familiar with, and that is what J. Richards has written in his book, The Privileged Planet. And that is that this planet right now is ideally suited to be a place that we can learn about the universe. That if it were anywhere else in the universe, it wouldn't work. If you look at the elliptical form of our axis with the Milky Way, we are in the exact right elliptical form. We have the capacity to look out and see the stars where we are. If we were at a different place in the Milky Way, we would see nothing. So we wouldn't discover anything. Matter of fact, if we were too close in, we would be destroyed by radiation, but that's another issue. Also, we are far enough away in the outer portion of the Milky Way to have more diffuseness, not only the angle. You have situations with the earth regarding the question of why is it, here's this, why is it the earth has a moon that just so happens to be in the proper proportion to the sun? And I think the figures of this, and I may be wrong on this, I didn't look this up for this, so I can't tell you if it's exact. I think I'm right on this. That it is something like 200 times smaller than the sun and 200 times the distance from the sun, so that it's able to be in reference to where the earth is in its proportion to the moon, that when we have an eclipse, we have a total eclipse, so that the sun can barely shine over the moon. It's not elongated, it's not too small, it's not too big, it's just right, and that wouldn't be sufficient if it weren't the right distance. So since it's the right distance and the right size, in reference to Earth, we get a solar eclipse, which provides the capacity of scientists to measure, which they could never do, and you wouldn't be able to figure out the speed of light or any of those questions if you didn't have solar eclipses. You know this? All these things are here. It's phenomenal. Now, the question of specified complexity is important to see. And I'm going to show you this here, and I'll show you more about it here in a few minutes. But let me just cover this, and I'll stop for the break. Don't go far. We will start again in about 5 minutes. Here is a way to argue the fact of intelligent design. Something can be specified but not demonstrate intelligent design. For example, B-L-U-E. I can take 4 Scrabble letters and throw them up. If I throw them enough times, probably the way in which I use the force of my throw, the order in which they fall, will form blue. That would give you specificity, but it does not provide complexity. It could happen by no major intent. Design. You can also have things that have complexity that do not demonstrate intelligent design. That is complex. But it conveys no information like blue does, which is, when I say specificity, I mean information, provides information. Specified complexity, though, does demonstrate intelligent design. 77 years ago, our fathers brought on this continent, nation conceived in liberty, is complex, but it also is intelligible. It conveys information. This is what we find in the cell structure. This is what we find in the DNA. This is what we find in the world. We find specified complexity to demonstrate design. Design requires designer. So, we'll stop there, and I'll talk to you about creation here in just a second.